Sure. Thanks so much, Joyce. My name is Brenda Ledley. I'm sure that you're familiar with me by now. I've been around for almost 4.5 years here at the Alliance. I'm really grateful to have Denise and Amy here from BC Gaming today to offer the insights about the guidelines of the gaming grants and also to answer your questions. And before we get started, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. I've been reading up on them and sort of taking workshops about land acknowledgements, and there's so much more than what they seem to be. It's really an opportunity to acknowledge a commitment, my own commitment in this case, to reconciliation and to acknowledging that we are on the stolen lands of the First Nations people here in British Columbia. I live out here on the lands of the Semiahmoo people in South Surrey, White Rock. And the other thing I've been learning about land acknowledgements is to approach them in a very personal way. And so I'd just like to say today that I'm trying to work in a good way by doing the land acknowledgement, but I really want to share my thoughts and my kind of confusion around the recent decision by the BC government to go ahead with the Site C dam. I understand, that it's going to flood over 5,500 acres of First Nations lands in Treaty 8, which is going to be a violation of their treaty rights. So it's very confusing for me when I see, that we have this, we've adopted UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and yet we continue to make decisions without acknowledging their treaty rights. So, and if you've ever read Thomas King's book, The Inconvenient Indian, you'll see that that's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's a lot of talk about goodwill, but then the actions don't fit with that. So I don't know how you feel about it, but to me, it's very upsetting. And I just really wish that that would change and that, we could be honest and, work together in a way that benefits everyone. So thank you for listening to that. That's me trying to make a land acknowledgement that is relevant and personal. So thank you for listening to that. And I'll turn it over now to Denise.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Brenda. And thank you to everyone for having me and for coming out this afternoon, virtually, albeit not in person, to hear about our program and just some of the changes that we've made for this year, and just a bit of an overview. So if folks are familiar with our program, this will be a bit of a refresher or an overview. If you're getting ready to submit your application, this might be helpful in preparation for that. And if it's a brand new program to you, hopefully this will provide you with all the information that you need to know in order to move forward with an application for grant funding. So yeah, thank you for everyone for coming. It's a great turnout, and I'm very happy to be here. As mentioned, we will have those questions at the end, so hopefully I'll be able to kind of answer them throughout as things pop up, but definitely if there are some things that are still left unanswered, I'm happy to answer that in the Q&A, or I'll also provide our contact information that you can get in touch with us afterwards if you want to ask your questions separately, or if it's kind of a more in detail example that you want to go through, I'm happy to do that afterwards as well. So myself, I'm here today from our branch, and also Amy Higginbotham, our director, is here. So I think she'll kind of join us for the Q&A portion, but I'll take us through the presentation and we'll go from there. So I will be turning off my camera for the presentation portion just so I don't distract. And also I have a cat tree with cats in the back who like to make an appearance once I get going. So also to not distract you from my little feline friends. So, okay, I'll get going. I'll pop off my video, but I'll come back in again for the Q&A portion. So let's get going. All right, so I thought I'd just kind of provide us with an overview, a bit of a roadmap of what we'll be talking about today. So we'll start off talking about what's new for the grant program for the 2021-2022 grant year. We'll then go into some of the program essentials of what the Community Gaming Grants program is about. I'll do a bit of an overview of the arts and culture sector with respect to our program. I'll then talk a bit about the eligibility criteria for both the organization and program, but also financial eligibility criteria for our program. I'll then talk about spending the grant. If you receive grant funding, which are the ways you can spend it and some of the spending rules. And then I'll talk about the application process itself, and I will leave us off with some resources where you can get in touch with us or others if you have additional questions about the program. So Brenda graciously gave us the land acknowledgement from where she's speaking from. I'm calling today from Victoria, which is the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. As we're all probably calling in from different areas, I kind of like to take this time for everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories we're here currently viewing the presentation from today. Okay, so what is new in 2020, 2021? I mean, it is no question in everyone's mind, the biggest factor over the past year has been COVID-19. It was a weird anniversary to recognize, I guess, the 1 year of working at home. I think we're all in the same boat in that respect. We've heard from many organizations over the past year who've had to kind of shift their programs and services, including modifying or canceling or postponing things until it was safe to do so. And certainly the challenging financial situation that many organizations are in or are getting themselves out of. In response to what we heard early spring last year, we adapted our program policies and procedures, and we're going to be continuing many of these through the 2021-2022 grant year. So basically what that means is that we've relaxed and adapted several of our program criteria in order to keep providing flexibility, really to make sure that organizations can continue to be eligible for the grant funding. So some of this includes relaxing our operating surplus criteria for return applicants, just recognizing that cash flow management has really been a challenge, both due to postponed programming, but also receiving temporary government aid. Similarly, we relaxed the 75% government funding limit for programs. Again, just noting that community and volunteer involvement has really been impacted as well. We've also relaxed the requirement for programs to have been delivered for 12 months at the time of application for return applicants, and for new programs that are addressing COVID-19 related community needs. And we've introduced one new temporary COVID-19 response measure for the year, and that is that community gaming grant funding can be used to create new paid positions in 2021. And hopefully this will help organizations to retain the people they need and increase their capacity by bringing on new staff that may have otherwise been volunteers. In addition, we update our guidelines every year in response to the input and feedback that we receive throughout the year from stakeholders, from organizations and applicants, and also from our staff. So these updates really are kind of policy changes and clarifications to improve the existing policy that we have. And that's just with the aim of continually improving our program and making it clear to organizations who are applying. And we've introduced 3 changes specifically in response to feedback that we heard from the arts and culture sector. So I just thought I would take a moment to talk about those. The first is that we've added some language to clarify that programs may have minor components that change in response to the community needs or to evolve or adapt as necessary and relevant. So for example, an ongoing annual exhibit that might change topics from year to year, or a community theater program that puts on different plays each season, or even a program that switches to online delivery. So these wouldn't be considered as new or different programs, as they are kind of part of the same established ongoing program. So we've just added that information into the programs to our program guidelines to clarify that we don't consider that a separate or a new program if it's part of the sort of umbrella of programming that takes place. We have also added a new eligible use of funds, and that's for cultural components that contribute to the inclusive delivery of a program. So basically, funds can be used to support the development or enhancement of relationships with Indigenous and diverse communities. And some examples of this might include things like cultural training, honorariums to Indigenous elders, food in some instances, things like that. And finally, we've added a couple new subsectors for the arts and culture sector. Particularly, we've added media arts and also literature. And that's just to better capture programming in the sector based on what we were seeing applicant organizations specifying themselves as in their previous applications. So that's kind of the overview of what's new this year. So our community gaming grants program guidelines are our main policy document for the program. All the changes that I just mentioned are in the 2021 guidelines for this year. And it also includes all the other information on our program. Whether you're new or returning, we always encourage everyone to read through the guidelines sort of from front to back in preparing and submitting your application, as it just helps to go through everything and make sure you're up to speed on what the requirements are for the program. So now we'll talk a bit about the program essentials, kind of the key information about our program. So we give out $140 million annually, and we do this through two kind of funding streams, if you like. There's our $135 million community gaming grant program, and this is really to help not-for-profits deliver their ongoing community programs. And we also have a separate $5 million capital project grant, and that's to help not-for-profits specifically with capital projects or acquisitions. And all of this is funded with commercial gaming revenues. So our grant program is not competitive, so all eligible organizations and programs will receive funding. Typically what that works out to with the applicants that we get is that 90% of the applicants will receive funding from our program. In 2020 and 2021, our most recent grant year, the average grant amount was $25,000. So there's actually no minimum grant amount that people can apply for. And I think that this average really reflects the majority of programming that's taking place at the local community level. And every year, approximately 5,000 organizations receive community gaming grant funding, which basically kind of works out to every unique community in BC. Some of their community programming receives some portion of community gaming grant funds, so that's pretty great. The community gaming grant program really supports organizations to deliver community-based programming across 6 different sectors. So there's the arts and culture sector, but there's also sport, environment, public safety, human and social services, as well as parent advisory councils and district parent advisory councils. So it really covers a wide range of programming. And at its core, this program is really about supporting organizations to deliver their ongoing programs that have a community benefit. So it's not a specifically arts grant program or a sport grant program or an environment grant program and so on. It's really a program that is about supporting community programs. So we don't evaluate the merit or quality of a program. The community gaming grants program is really just looking to see that there's a community support for the program, that the community sees value in the programming and is a part of it. This can be demonstrated through lots of different things. So volunteer involvement, the community members coming out to benefit from the organization's programs, the community supporting what the organization does through donations, all sorts of things. And really the reason that we have this community-centered focus is that organizations really know their communities best, and they're really best placed to determine what the needs are. And we see this through the community's participation in the program. And just a note on community, really the word community can refer to both a geographical reach in terms of individuals located in such and such neighborhood or town or city, but it can also refer to groups of people with a common interest. So we kind of look at how many people are involved, but also who's involved and whose needs are being met. So we have 3 different funding levels, depending on the size and scope of programming that's provided. We have at the local level, local organizations can apply for a maximum of up to $100,000. Regional organizations that serve more of a larger regional area can apply for up to $225,000. And provincial organizations can apply for up to $250,000. And funding is awarded based on the size, scope, and community benefit, as demonstrated through the program description, and also through the demonstrated financial need that is seen through the program financials and the program budget, which provides information on the program's previous 12-month delivery. In addition, some additional factors to consider would be, obviously the funding request that's made by the organization is a factor. First, in that, we wouldn't award more than what an organization requests. But second, I think, organizations may ask for the maximum amount or a larger ask in, anticipation that they might not receive the full amount. And organizations may be disappointed if they don't receive that full request, but our main advice is really to ask for what you need, as demonstrated by your program financials and what it takes to run your program. And the other piece is that we are a demand-driven program, and we do have a fixed budget of $140 million. So the amount of funding we're able to give and what's available is really carefully managed to make sure that we can support all eligible organizations. So this means that funding levels are not guaranteed from year to year, really just based on that demand and managing that demand. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the arts and culture sector. Okay, so beyond those overarching program criteria I mentioned, we do have some criteria that is specific to each sector. And that really just speaks to the kind of organizations and programming that are funded within each sector. So for the arts and culture sector, our grant specifically supports organizations that deliver programs that provide public access to and preservation of the arts, heritage, or culture. Programs that primarily support artists or artistic development are not eligible under our program, as are costs that would be related to research or development of new programs. So we fund arts and culture organizations that have a strong volunteer component. Volunteers serve as board members, are involved in the governance of the organization, and volunteers are involved in the delivery of programming. So basically, those with an interest in the organization can be a part of what they're doing. And as I've mentioned, the organizations deliver programs that are open and accessible to the community. Community, again, both in terms of people in a given area, but also groups of people with a shared common interest. Okay, so we've got a little snapshot here of grant funding in our previous grant year in 2020-2021. Although 2020 was very atypical in many ways, the funding that we provided and the number of organizations that we supported in 2020 was pretty constant, actually. So in 2020-2021, we funded over 700 organizations, and that was to support almost 1,300 unique programs. And altogether, we provided $18 million in funding to the arts and culture sector in the province. 89% of all arts and culture applications were approved and received funding. So that's right on par with the rest of our community gaming grants program. And the average grant amount was just over $30,000. So that's a bit higher than the community gaming grants average. And again, that just reflects the amount of programming that's delivered at that local community level. And in terms of what organizations request in funding support and what is awarded, over 65% of all grant recipients got more than 70% of their funding request. Said in another way, basically for every for every $1,000 that an organization requested, we funded $700 for 65% of all organizations. So, another way to think about this is that we really only provide 75%, up to 75% of a program's funding. So I think the arts and culture sector is doing a really good job at maximizing the amount of funding that they're getting from our program to support their programs. Our community gaming grant funding reached 117 unique communities in 2020 and 2021. The funding definitely does tend to reflect where the majority of people live. So we see this concentrated more in the Lower Mainland and the Vancouver Island and coast area. We've also started to collect some self-reported information on programming, and you've probably seen this on the application. And we were just looking to see, where programming is targeted to support specific groups. So what we learned is that over 41% of program funding will benefit children and youth, 8% will benefit Indigenous peoples, and 9% will benefit persons with disabilities. So that's great that we're able to have that information and just see where the funding is being targeted. So now I'll talk a bit about the organization eligibility. So as I've mentioned a few times now, this program is really for not-for-profit. So in order to be eligible for a grant, an organization must obviously be a not-for-profit. The organization must deliver programs and services to their community. Having an open membership is also a criteria. And having a volunteer board and voting membership is also an organization eligibility criteria. And we do have a bit of parameters with respect to the amount of the proportion rather of voting members to board members. So there must be more than double the amount of voting members to board members. So a little example would be if there were 5 board members, we would need to see at least 11 voting members because that would be more than double the amount. Those board members must be democratically chosen, and 2/3 of them must reside in BC. And the other part is that board members don't receive remuneration for their doing the responsibilities that come along with their roles as board members. An organization would be ineligible for a grant on the other side of the coin if they were a for-profit organization, as obviously that's not what we're about. If the organization were a member-funded society, that is a specific type of society under the Societies Act, and that's really just an organization that is set up specifically for their membership and isn't necessarily open and inclusive to everyone else. We do not fund political parties, political action groups, or lobby groups, nor do we provide funding to any level of government, from federal down to local government level. An organization that is an educational institution or school or provincially or municipally operated facility is also not eligible for funding. So on the program eligibility side, so as I mentioned earlier, our program really supports a wide range of programs across many different sectors. And all of our programs have the same program eligibility. We do fund on a program basis, which means that we provide funding for the programs themselves and not for the organization's operational costs. And the way that we've defined a program is that it's an ongoing service, activity, or series of activities. Again, the Community Gaming Grants program is really focused on supporting programs that benefit the community, respond to a community's needs, and are accessible and open to all community members. And we fund programs that are already ongoing in a community. So programs must be delivered for at least 12 months before they would be eligible for grant funding from our program. This is one of those criteria that is being relaxed for this year. So just imagine there's a little asterisk there. But generally speaking, all programs must be delivered for at least 12 months in the community before they would be eligible for funding. So eligible programs, some criteria for those. As I mentioned, that 12-month delivered requirement is one of those criteria, although for this year it is being relaxed. The programs must be directly delivered by the applicant. They must be ongoing, so they're not a one-off project or a time-limited sort of event. They must provide immediate and direct service to the community, and they must be accessible and inclusive. So they're open to the community. There aren't any unnecessary restrictions to being involved. So how does an organization apply for a program? There's two examples that kind of depend on how your organization is set up and how you run your programs. So the first example here is where an organization delivers one program, which means basically that all activities that you do fall under one program. So the example here is the Sunshine Theatre Society. Has one program. It's the Sunshine Theatre program. Program includes everything that they do. So they have seasonal production costs that fall under there, promotion and advertising. Basically everything they do is to facilitate that program. Another example is where an organization might offer multiple different programs that are maybe related, but they are sort of separate and unique from each other. So the organization can apply for funding for each discrete program within the same application. In this example, we've got the Sunshine Arts Council. They've got 3 different programs. We've got a public art display and gallery program. There's a summer folk music festival program, and there's a youth art lessons and kid camps program. So those are all separate and distinct. Each program does require sort of separate program descriptions to kind of encapsulate what each of those are about, as well as program financials that cover each of those programs. And we'll talk a bit about that in a bit. So an ineligible program, kind of related to what I was saying before, is a program that really just exclusively serves an organization's membership and isn't inclusive of other people in the community who want to be a part of it. So they're not open to the public. Programs that provide financial assistance to individuals are not eligible programs. Fundraising programs or social enterprise programs are not eligible, as are programs that are really just about operating a facility or a venue. Programs that deliver vocational training are not eligible under our program, nor are programs that are delivered on contract or under a funding agreement. And programs that primarily benefit other organizations and not the general community are not eligible. And finally, kind of underlines the whole thing is that programs that don't deliver an immediate and direct service to the community would not be eligible, as our program is about delivering programs to individuals in the community. So as part of the application, organizations must submit a program description for each program that they are applying for funding for. And this is really just intended to be a summary of all the core information that someone would need to know in order to really understand what your program is all about and what it is that you do. How many people it benefits and who it serves, when and how often it happens, where it takes place, and how the program reflects and meets the community's needs. So the program description is really where you tell us both the quantitative and numerical sort of hard facts in terms of the who, what, where, and why, but it's also where organizations can tell us the qualitative and storytelling side. So why your program is needed, the gap that it fills, why it's important to your community, and all the great outcomes that it achieves. So this is the part of the community benefit piece, and it's also considered alongside those sort of hard numbers. So the program description is really evaluated as a whole. We understand that different groups or sectors may use different terminology when describing their program. And we definitely do not strike out an application if we see some particular phrasing used or that might indicate that the program could be ineligible. So for example, if you describe your program as a project when really you mean a program, we might raise this in your notification letter or contact you for more clarity, but we do look at the whole picture when assessing your program and your application as a whole. And the most important thing is that you describe your program as accurately as possible. That said, there are some terms that we wanted to share that might shed a bit more light on what is and isn't eligible through our grant. So the first is training or professional development or even mentorship. So volunteer training is an acceptable use of funds under our program, but programs or grant funds that are intended to support professional development and staff training are not. The terms in development or creation phase or research. So community gaming grant funds the delivery of programming that's already present and delivered in the community. We don't fund the research and development stage of programs. And the word new in the same token, because we don't fund existing programs, we won't fund a new program that has not been delivered for at least 12 months. This existing delivery demonstrates that community support as the program has been in operation before there was ever community gaming grant funding in the picture, and funding decisions are based off of the revenue and expenses that have been incurred over the past 12 months. And growth, sort of in the same token, community gaming grant funding doesn't fund planned program growth or expansion. Organizations can apply for an increase in funding that's based off of the demonstrated program growth and demand over the past 12 months, but we don't provide funding upfront to help facilitate that. The word project, so the term project generally refers to kind of a time-limited activity. And the community gaming grant program is about ongoing sustained programming. We understand that there might be activities or components of an ongoing program that are time limited but are reoccurring. So for example, the annual production of a play or an annual event, things like that. If that is the case, then the organization could describe how there is an enduring ongoing program under which there may be elements that change or have a reoccurring life cycle. And finally, the word partner. So we provide funding to organizations to support their activities or costs to deliver a program. When organizations work together to co-deliver a program, but maybe are submitting the same description and financial information to us, it's kind of difficult to tease out who's responsible for what piece and who incurred which cost. So if organizations are working together to partner or collaborate, they should work together to make clear kind of who delivers which activities and the costs associated with that delivery. And if this is something that applies to your organization, you can definitely get in touch with us and we can help you to kind of tease those things out. Okay, so financial eligibility. So we have financial criteria for both the organization level and the program level. On the organization side, organization financial statements are reviewed to determine whether the organization as a whole has a financial need. And this is because we want to ensure that our grant funding is going toward organizations who have that true financial need and need that support. So for us to assess the organization's financial need, there are a few different documents that we look at. So we look at the revenue and expense statement for the previous fiscal year. This would be the most recently complete entire fiscal year. We look at the balance sheet for the previous fiscal year, so it covers the same time period. We look at the organization's budget for the current fiscal year, and if there's any accompanying notes to the financial statements for the previous year, we look at those as well. An organization would be temporarily ineligible for a grant if it exhibits conditions that basically cast significant doubt on its financial stability, or if it has more than 50% of its previous fiscal year's operating expenses on hand in unrestricted funds at the start of its current fiscal year. And this is one of those criteria, again, that we are temporarily relaxing for the year for return applicants who've been affected by COVID-19. They wouldn't have their funding levels negatively impacted if they do have a surplus that's greater than 50% of their previous year's operating costs. And so I mentioned the organization financial eligibility criteria. So we also have separate program financial eligibility criteria for each program. So for us to assess that, we require the program revenue and expense statement or the actuals for the previous fiscal year, and a program budget for the current fiscal year for each program that the organization is applying for funding. One of the program financial criteria is that government funding cannot exceed 75% of the total program cost. And one of the main reasons for this is to see that demonstrated community support for the program. So basically, applicants must have at least 25% of their program operating costs coming from non-government sources. And this can be demonstrated in a few different ways, through user fees, fundraising, donations, in-kind contributions, and so on. If government funding exceeds that 75% threshold, funding may be limited or denied. Again, this is one of those criteria that for this year for return applicants who have been impacted by COVID-19, you wouldn't have your funding levels negatively impacted if you can't meet that criteria. And in your program financials, all sources of your program revenue must be clearly stated, just so we can see that to be able to make that determination of what is and what isn't government funding. So I've mentioned a few different financial documents. So here's a bit of a summary, little cheat sheet. So for the organization level financials, we require that organization balance sheet for the most recently completed fiscal year. We require the organization revenue and expense statement for the most recently completed fiscal year. And we require the organization's budget for the current fiscal year. And on the program side of things, for each program that the organization is applying for funding for, we require the program revenue and expense statement for the most recently completed fiscal year, the program budget for the current fiscal year, and a program in-kind contribution summary if organizations are including those in-kind contributions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And our website has examples of all of these financial documents that I've mentioned here. They're a really great resource to just see how that's laid out, if that's something that you kind of want to have an example to go off of and build your own on. So I just mentioned that in-kind contribution summary. So organizations can include in-kind support or contributions as part of their program financials. It's a really great way to not only show that community support and investment in your program, but these contributions can also be a really good way to show greater program revenue and expenses and support your requests for funding. It can also really help if organizations are finding that government funding is making up a large portion of their program revenue that might put them over that 75% government funding limit for their program. So in-kind support can be used to contribute toward the remaining 25% of a program's operating costs. And this really helps groups that might not have many other funding sources. So in-kind support can include any combination of volunteer time, donated labor, equipment, services, and materials from other third-party sources over the last 12 months. And the way that we value volunteerism and donations kind of follows these standards for our program. So for donated materials, they're valued at verified fair market value. Similarly, donated accredited professional services like an accountant would also be valued at verified fair market value. And volunteer labor is valued at up to $20 an hour. So just a note on that hourly rate for volunteers is just for the purpose of calculating the in-kind volunteer contributions in grant applications for our specific program. So you wouldn't necessarily use that elsewhere. It's just for this program. And if you do include any in-kind contribution in your program financials, this should be listed as both a revenue and expense so that those amounts both total to zero. And the information on your program's in-kind support must be submitted using our in-kind contribution summary, which can be found on our website. And that just helps us to determine those eligible costs. So basically the costs related to the program delivery. And like everything else that you hold on to, complete records of all your volunteer hours and your donated services or materials must be retained as part of your gaming records. So I've kind of talked about a few different timing points here, and I know that if you're anything like me, the fiscal year and timing just kind of gets tangled into a knot in your head. So I have a couple of different examples to just kind of make clear what reference periods we're talking about when we talk about things like budget and actuals, and how that kind of falls with the arts and culture intake in an organization's fiscal year. So hopefully these kind of examples, you'll be able to see yourself in them and figure out how that applies to your situation. So for the arts and culture intake, that runs from February 1st to April 30th. So in this example here, the organization's fiscal year is January 1st to December 31st, which is your normal calendar year. So in this example, the organization would apply on April 1st. So what that would mean then is that the organization revenue and expenses and balance sheet and the program actuals would be for the previous fiscal year, which would be the period of January 1st to December 31st of 2020. That's the most recently completed fiscal year. Where an organization, maybe they haven't had a chance to get their finalized financial statements ready, you can always provide the draft or internally prepared financial statements to us. That's perfectly fine. And then for the program budget and the organization budget for the current fiscal year, well, that would be for the fiscal year that they're now in. That's January 1st to December 31st of 2021. And the budget should really demonstrate how the grant would be spent in that period, assuming you're planning on spending it for costs that you haven't incurred yet. Funding can be spent up to 12 months from when the funding was received. It can also be used for costs that were incurred in the same fiscal year that the grant was received. So as an example, say the organization received funding on May 1st of 2021, they can spend that funding up to May 1st of 2022, or they can reimburse for costs that were incurred between January 1st to May 31st. So in that same fiscal year. So there's actually, in a lot of cases, more than a 12-month period that an organization can spend their funding. So that's one example. Another example here, just using a different fiscal year, because I know a lot of folks do have the April 1st to March 31st as their fiscal year. So kind of the same example, arts and culture intake is from February 1st to April 30th. This organization's fiscal year runs from April 1st to March 31st. They're still applying on April 1st. So basically the organization and program actuals for the most recently completed fiscal year will be from April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. In this instance, the fiscal year, the previous fiscal year has just closed one day earlier, but it is the most recently complete. So this is the reference year that's required. Again, you can submit your internal or draft financials if your financials are not ready, which is probably quite likely since the year just ended. Or you can, you've got 3 months to apply in that intake, so you can wait a few weeks or however long until you have all your financial statements in order and you're ready to submit your application. The program budget and the organization budget would be in the current fiscal year that's just started as of April 1st. So that would be the budget year that you would be preparing your documents for. And I have one more example. So again, we're using that organization fiscal year of April 1st to March 31st. And say the organization applies a bit earlier this time. So they apply March 1st of 2021. So the organization and program actuals will be for the same, for the previous fiscal year. So that would be for April 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2021. That is the most recently completed fiscal year, because you're still in the 2020-2021 fiscal year, which ends March 31st. So for the program and organization budget, ideally, this would be for the year that starts April 1st, 2021. Although you're still in the current fiscal year, there's really only 1 month left. So assuming you intend to spend your grant funding for future expenses, the budget would probably show what that future program budget would be. Again, you can consider timing on this. If you feel like it might be a little more simple to wait until the next fiscal year is open, then you can definitely do that. You do have 3 months to sort of figure out the timing of your own fiscal year and when you'll have your financial paperwork in place. So yeah, I would say just keep those things in mind and when it makes sense for your organization to apply within that intake period. So hopefully those examples will help a little bit more. And I think, if you need to return to this in terms of the recording, or we can provide the slides out after if this is something that might be helpful, we're happy to do that. Okay, so spending the grant. So grant funds are really to cover costs that are essential to the direct delivery of an approved program. So the things that you could spend the grant on would be wages of existing paid positions related to that program, rent, utilities, and insurance that related to the program, program supplies, office supplies, any program advertising, things like that, the rental or purchase of equipment that's needed for you to directly deliver that program. Some travel can be covered as well. So travel that's essential to the delivery of the program within BC is an eligible expense. Some out of province travel is also possible. There is a separate request sort of process for that. I don't imagine there's a lot of that happening right now, but that is something that does exist. So grant funds aren't intended to fund an organization's core operating cost. However, an organization can allocate a percentage of your core operating costs related to wages, utilities, and things like that towards the program if costs are directly related to the program delivery. So the example here, say you have an employee, they spend 40% of their time working on an eligible program. In this example, we'll say that's a museum display. The rest of the time is spent working on non-eligible programs or on just general sort of admin or operational duties. So say there's a gift shop, they do some grant writing, they do some board work, and that takes up the other 60% of their time. In this example, 40% of the employee's wage could be included as a program expense. So it would be a prorated amount of what that employee's wage was. Another example, so we've got multiple programs in this case. Say an organization's director spends an equal amount of time on 4 programs in addition to some organization core duties. 3 of these are approved programs. So in this case, if the program director's time is spent equally on all 5, 20% of the director's wage could be included as an expense of each of those approved program budgets. And the same principle, of course, applies to other core costs like rent or utility, supplies, insurance, and so on. So that's kind of how that would work for the prorating of costs for each of your individual programs. So in addition to regular program funding, applicants can request funding for both minor capital projects and capital acquisitions. So for capital projects, we're talking about projects under $20,000. They are all of the programs or projects rather would be essential for the delivery of an approved program. So they're there to help you be able to deliver that program. Some examples would be things like wheelchair ramps or small renovations. On the capital acquisition side of things, again, these are required for the delivery of an approved program. We do require quotes if it's over $5,000. And some of the things that we funded under this would be things like computer equipment or other specialized equipment that's related to your program. One thing to note is that organizations can't apply for minor capital projects or capital acquisitions only. So a request for a minor capital project or acquisition would be part of the funding request for your community gaming grant program, and it would be related to that program. So just to make that note there. So all organizations must have a separate account for receiving, holding, and dispersing their grant funds. All eligible expenses should be paid directly from the gaming account if possible, but you may transfer either by check or electronically from your gaming account to your general or your operating account to reimburse eligible program expenses. The way you disperse the funding is, again, through either check or board approved electronic transfer, and all invoices and receipts must be retained for 5 years. As I mentioned just a minute or two ago about the time frame for spending, so grant funds must be spent within 12 months from when the funding was received. You can also spend your funding for costs incurred in the same fiscal year that the grant was received. So for example, if your organization's fiscal year was the calendar year, January 1st to December 31st, and you received your grant on April 1st of 2021, you could either spend your grant forwards until April 1st of 2022, or you could spend it sort of backwards to the beginning of your fiscal year, which started on January 1st. And all gaming grant funding, or spending rather, should be reported in your gaming account summary report. So all organizations that receive community gaming grant funding or have previously received it and still have funding have to submit a gaming account summary report. And this has to be submitted within 90 days of your organization's fiscal year end. So the gaming account summary report basically tells all the activity in your gaming account for the year. So it'll show the balance at the beginning of the fiscal year, any grant funds that you received through the year, what you spent the funding on, and then the balance at the end of the fiscal year. There's also a section to show how the community benefited from the gaming grant funding and what they did with that funding through the year, just as a separate other little section there. All organizations must submit your recent gaming account summary report in order to receive another community gaming grant or capital project grant. And the whole purpose, obviously, as a reporting function is to make sure that grant funding is used only on eligible expenses. If you're looking for an example gaming account summary report just to see what it looks like, or you're looking for a blank one for yourself, you can find each of those on our website. So applying for the grant. So as I mentioned not too long ago, the arts and culture intake runs from February 1st to April 30th, and notifications should be received by August 31st. All applications are done through our website. We don't accept paper applications. And any documentation that is required as part of the application must be either attached to the application itself, or it can be emailed in after the fact, up to 2 weeks after the application was submitted. And before you apply, I've made this mention a couple times, but it definitely helps to review our program guidelines and the resources on our website, just to have some valuable examples to go off of. So we have our pre-application checklist. We've got sample financial statements of all the different financial statements that I've mentioned. We've got some frequently asked questions and answers, and we've got application tutorials as well. If your application is denied, or you would like to request that the branch reconsiders their decision, we do have a reconsideration request process that organizations can go through. The reconsideration request must be made within 30 days of notification and in writing. and it must state the reasons why the decision should be varied or overturned. So new information or documentation isn't accepted. Basically the purpose of the reconsideration request is to make sure that the original decision was done so correctly and fairly. So a final decision is made within 90 days of receiving that request. So that's kind of the time frame for those. And here's just a couple of tips and advice. You don't necessarily have to go in this order, but it's kind of a sequential walkthrough of things that are kind of helpful when you're preparing your application. Again, read those program guidelines, as I've said. The pre-application checklists are really good to just make sure that you have all the pieces in place. You can review those example documents on our website just to see that you've got all the required information. If possible and if helpful to you, it can help to have a professional review your financials. When you have all your documentation ready to go, it's really helpful to have those saved as a Word or a PDF for easy upload. If you do have specific questions, we have our helpline. There's someone available every day to answer any questions that you have. If your previous year notification letter had some items that it was mentioned that needed to be addressed, definitely make sure that you've taken those steps and you've spoken to us if you need to, or you've been able to address those and rectify them for your new application. You can also attach a cover letter that kind of runs through those if you feel that's helpful. As I just mentioned, make sure that those gaming account summary reports have been submitted. And finally, if you're able to apply as early in the intake as possible, we do assess our applications in the order that they've been received. So the earlier you submit, the earlier you get a decision. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our community gaming grant program. I'm just going to quickly run through the capital project grant just so you kind of know what it's about. We will be having separate sessions on this grant program in particular. So this is just kind of the broad overview. So 2021 will be the 5th year of our capital project grant program. As I mentioned earlier, the objective is really to help not-for-profits complete capital projects, and all, of course, to make sure that there's a project that provides significant benefit to communities. So the capital project program is for specifically those capital projects with a total cost between $20,000 to $1.25 million. We are strict on that amount. The reason we have this kind of dollar reference is that we're looking for projects that are really within the scope of a not-for-profit organization. So we're not looking to fund mega projects or multi-year projects. The sectors for the main community gaming grant program also apply here. So any grant would need to fall under one of those 6 sectors. The organization eligibility is the same as their community gaming grant program as well. And between 20 and 50% of the total cost of a project may be funded. And the maximum grant amount is $250,000 for this as well. So matching funds from the applicant organization are required for this program, and these must be on hand at the time of application. We will accept, a good bona fide commitment or a promissory type situation, but funding is in hand is definitely a stronger case for an application. Successful applicants will get what they've applied for. So, assuming all the requirements are met, you've told us that your project will cost you X amount of dollars and you need a certain amount of support from us. We will give you what you asked for to make sure that that project will be able to be completed. And finally, one of the other unique things about this project, or this program rather, is that the assessment process is competitive. So applicants are really encouraged to put forward their strongest application as possible, just knowing that other people are doing the same thing too. We don't have the intake dates for a capital project grant yet for this year, but please check back on our website if it is something you're interested in. In the past, the capital project grant is open during the summer. So you can expect, roughly the same period. Organizations can only submit one application per year and just for one project. So not for phases or projects or cascading projects. We're looking for one complete and total project. There should only be one lead in the application and project. Organizations can certainly get the support of other organizations and work together, but one organization has to assume responsibility for the project. And the other part is that you can still apply for your regular community gaming grant as well. These are separate and distinct programs. And like our regular guidelines, we do have its own sector guide, we call it, and that's updated each year. So we're just working on that right now. So hopefully that'll be out in the not too distant future, as well as the dates for the new grant year. So we have sort of different project categories under the capital project grant. As I mentioned, there's only one grant application per applicant and only one project per grant. So applicants can only apply for one of these project categories. So, an organization could apply for a suite of building restoration activities, but you couldn't also apply for a suite of vehicles. So basically, organizations need to pick one project that they want to complete. And that's because we want to see successful completion of one total project and not a bunch of half-completed projects. So there are three categories. We've got facilities. So this would be constructing or renovating or maintaining an organization's existing facilities. Community infrastructure projects, and that's really about developing public amenities. And then finally, we have acquisitions. So that's fixed capital assets for long-term ownership and use by the applicant organization. So here we don't fund research or development. We're really looking to fund those hard assets. Each project category has its own kind of unique eligibility criteria, but generally speaking, they include things like making sure that the project is for community benefit and accessible to the public upon completion, and that the organization has the right to build or modify land, if that applies. And that would be shown through things like proof of ownership or lease or permission. And I mentioned that there's an assessment competitive assessment. So for the breakdown of how that is awarded, there's a portion allocated to community benefit. We have a small amount for inclusiveness and accessibility. We have some portion allocated to project feasibility, as well as financial consideration and environmental efficiency, if that actually applies to a project. And if it doesn't, groups can indicate why that is the case. So that is our capital project grant in a nutshell. So I'm going to leave us off now with some resources if you want to look into for further information or you want to get in touch with us to ask more questions. I've mentioned our website a few times, so that is the web address up there. We also have a phone line that we have someone on staff every single day. If there's a question you want to ask and you want to get somebody over the phone. We also have a general email inbox where you can email those questions into, as well as the community outreach manager inbox, which I manage, and our policy analyst, although we don't have a policy analyst at the moment, but generally speaking, there's two of us that manage that one. We also work with a couple of different organizations. The first one is the BC Association of Charitable Gaming, and they are a provincial not-for-profit themselves that you may know of. And basically, they liaise between community groups and our branch, and they receive some of gaming grant funding to basically provide support services to charities and not-for-profits, specifically for the purpose of applying for community gaming grants. So they can get into your application with you. They can also answer questions. They put on webinars and things like that as well. So they're a wonderful resource. And then we also have the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers, and they also receive community gaming grant funding. And they have a similar mandate to the BCACG, in terms of providing that support. However, they are more focused on providing support to Indigenous not-for-profit organizations. And then finally, there are several community charitable gaming and grant associations throughout the province. They're not necessarily in every community, but you may find that there are a couple that are closely located to where you are. So they kind of the same thing. They're regionally based not-for-profit that support their local charities and community groups in their area with their applications for community gaming grants. So I'll go back and forth between these screens in case you guys want to take down some information. But otherwise, we are now at the sort of question period. So hopefully I've answered some of those through the course of the presentation. But otherwise, I am here to answer any other ones. And Amy, I think, is here as well. So I'll put on my screen. I've got some hail happening outside my window right now, and my cat is very interested in it. So just for an added entertainment. But yeah, so Joyce, I don't know if we've received any questions.
Thank you so much, Denise. That was super informative. So yeah, now we have some time for Q&A until 2:30. So if you have a question, you can either post the word question in the chat, and then I'll call on you to unmute and ask your question yourself, or you can post your full question in the chat and I'll read that out to Denise for you. Okay, so I see we have a first question here. We have 24 months to spend our 2020 gaming grant. Do we still need to submit a GASR after 12 months?
Yes, so yeah, even though there's that additional 12 months for grant funding that was received last year, you still do have to do the annual gaming account summary report for any funding that you have in your gaming account.
Great. And is the online application still a one-sitting process, or can the application be saved throughout the process?
Unfortunately, it is still a one-time go. It is a bit of an old system, so it doesn't have the capabilities to save and go back, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that's where those things like the application tutorial, but also the checklist are helpful to just make sure you're sitting down, you're ready to go, and you have all those things so you don't have to kind of exit and then come back.
Okay, and before I move on to the next question here, Denise, you'd mentioned that you would be okay with sharing the slides. So as long as that's okay with you, I'll email those out to everyone afterwards. Okay, great. So yes, the slides will be shared with everyone. And Stephanie Fisher has a question. So Stephanie, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, Denise, you were talking about that we can create a new paid position. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure.
How that works for a returning client?
Mm-hmm. So I think what we would kind of expect to see for that is, if that is something that you're planning on doing, that would probably show up in your program budget. You know, your personnel costs would be going up for the year. And you would put your funding request to us. If you are successful in your application, you will receive funding. And basically what that means is, we'll provide you, a certain amount of funding for the things that you had told us that you were planning on doing for the year. And then, it's up to you as how you want to spend that funding to support your program activities for the year. So you could put that funding toward a new position if you choose.
But that new position would be directly linked to a program.
Yes. Yeah, okay. It would be part of the program. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Colleen, you are next to ask your question. Colleen Lanke.
Hi, Denise. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question about volunteer hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that other organizations may have already done this, but is the volunteer hours, you can put them in the budget, but what if we don't have them usually in our actuals? It's something that our accountant has sort of shrugged about, saying, well, it's good for some things, but really not great to like beef up your budget with so many volunteer hours for other things. So how would you recommend dealing with that? Or what is what do you guys look for?
Yeah, so I mean, generally speaking, with an accountant, I think they would be more focused on your organization's overall financials. And typically you wouldn't, you wouldn't reflect the volunteer hours in there, but it's in your separate program financials that you could reflect that. So generally speaking, those are kind of more like internally prepared, and that's where you could put in those in-kind contributions, whether that's volunteer hours or donated materials and services and things like that. So, those program financials, I don't think they're quite the same in terms of what you would be showing to the society at the end of the year. They're not what you would file. So I think that's kind of how you want to prepare them. And a lot of groups do that specifically for the purposes of our grant. So it is kind of more of an internal document, if you like, that you can reflect those a little bit differently.
Right. So ultimately preparing two versions of a year-end financials, one internal and one external. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, if you do have that sort of that structure. And I would say also to take a look at the examples on our website. I think that the visual of that might be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
And the next question is to clarify about the 25% versus 75% ratio of the private and public funding. Does that 25% of private funding represent the maximum or the minimum amount?
That would be the minimum. The 25%. There needs to be a 25% minimum of that sort of community support.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, I'm wondering if the awarded funds must be spent according to organization's fiscal year or according to the current calendar year, or can they be spent in both directions, i.e. backwards for fiscal year and forwards for calendar year?
A bit of both. So I'll maybe re-explain that. So when an organization receives the funding, they have 12 months from that date forward to spend the funding. So that may span multiple calendar years, depending on when you get the funding. It also may span multiple organizations' fiscal years. But yes, we are talking about, I guess, calendar years when the funding is received. So, the day one you receive the funds, you have 12 months to spend that. If an organization is sort of partway through their fiscal year, they can also spend that money backwards or reimburse costs toward the beginning of their fiscal year. So it can range more than 12 months on the forward side, but also you can go a little bit backwards depending on where you're at in your organization's fiscal year.
Thank you. And the next question is about in-kind labor. Is $20 the maximum amount that can be entered? And I think Amy is referring to that $20 an hour wage.
Yeah, so for just general volunteer hours, yes. If it is something that's more of like an accredited or professional service, like the example I usually use is an accountant, that's something that's a bit more specialized than some kind of volunteer work that any person could provide. So if it is a professional or accredited service, you would value that at whatever the going rate was. If it's just for general volunteer purposes, that's $20 an hour. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In the case of the relaxed opportunities like applying for a position or cultural components, would these be considered as new programs?
They would, all of that would be related to an ongoing program. So just to clarify, the cultural components, it's not just a one-time thing. This is something that we've included going forward for, hopefully for forever. But for the new positions, that is something that is just for this year. And that would be for a program that an organization already has in place.
Due to some personnel changes, we have outstanding GASRs dating back a few years. What is the best way to approach rectifying this prior to putting in a new application? Should we talk to a program officer directly?
Yes, that would probably be a good idea, just to make sure that they know what needs to be submitted and what may be outstanding, and that we can have that on file and so that we know that we've had that conversation and that that's on its way to us.
If we already have multiple programs funded, but elements of one program have expanded or grown, should we keep these as elements of our regular programming or list them as their own program?
I would say that probably depends. It's a little bit hard to know without knowing the details, but if it is related to the core of what that program is about, and your program has grown, you can show us that growth. You can say, over the past 12 months, we've had an increase in demand for what we're providing. Or we've been able to add additional components to this sort of this body of work, this body of programming that we have, and show us that it has in fact grown. Or if they are kind of separate and distinct things that really ought to be treated separately, they can be kind of carved off into their own program. Again, it's a little hard to know without the specifics. And if that doesn't answer the question, I would say, you can get in touch with us and we can have that conversation about what might make sense for you.
Great. This next question says, we understand BC gaming support must be below a certain percentage of total project costs, but fundraising possibilities have been significantly compromised over the past year. Is that percentage still strictly mandated?
Yeah, so that's part of those relaxations that we've done for this year. So for the organization side of things, if groups are either sitting on quite a bit of cash assets that they weren't able to spend, we will not penalize a group. Similarly, on the program side, if their community contributions are down because fundraising was down, and they're kind of over that 75% government funded limit. Again, we are relaxing that this year for return applicants as well. So we definitely recognize both of those are factors, and things are not quite what they normally are. So yeah, we will not be penalizing folks negatively if that is the case for this year.
Okay, next question is, we are submitting a renewed funding application. Compared with the regular funding application, it appears that you don't want us to provide AGM minutes, balance sheet information. At least they don't appear on the renewed funding pre-application checklist as being items that are required. Is this correct, or have I misunderstood?
I don't know if I could tell you in my brain the itemized list of things on the renewed funding, but yeah, I would say that the checklist is your best resource. But yes, there are fewer things that organizations have to submit as part of the renewed funding application, just because we've gone through that process with them many times in the past. There were no issues, so the amount of required documentation is lower for the renewed application. So yes, there will be some things that you don't need to provide that in your regular application you normally would have, but yes, go with what the pre-application checklist says, and then it should marry up perfectly with what the application itself is asking.
Okay, thank you. And Stephanie has a question next. So Stephanie, you can unmute.
Yeah, our fiscal year end is April 30th, which is always a little bit tricky, of course, with BC Gaming.
Right.
But for our budget, like our 2020-21 budget, we actually did not put together the usual operating budget because of COVID. We didn't know what to expect. So we have a cash flow budget, which we are, every month it gets updated. And of course, the cash flow budget shows not the entire picture of our organization, because we received some funding, of course, from the federal government, and we had less expenditures. So it looks like we have like a huge budget, which is not the case because it's all predetermined in how we have to spend it. So my question is, how am I going to deal with putting in the current fiscal year budget?
Right. So for that, I think we know it's a bit like reading a fortune teller saying, like, what is it going to be like for this year? we're just asking basically that people put together their best anticipated guess, if guess is the right word, their educated guess, I would say, about what they're going to be able to deliver over the next 12 months. We don't hold people to that budget. Obviously, things change as they have done, but give us your best laid plans of what you hope to be able to accomplish for the next 12 months, and what you're thinking that will cost you, and what it's going to cost to put on that programming. I think that's the best advice that I could give for that.
Yeah, and I'm talking about not the programming budget. I'm pretty sure I can I can deal with that, no problem at all, because I know what we want to deliver and how much it will cost us. I'm talking about our organizational budget for the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the same principle would apply. I think a lot of the time people build their budgets off of what it's cost them in the past. So, you can take that as your sort of benchmark and adjust as necessary. But, we don't. Yeah, that's really a question that's best suited for the organization, as we don't know the specifics of what it costs to run the programs and all the other administrative and sort of background costs that might be relevant. But yeah, again, you put together your organization's budget as best you possibly can, and we go based off of that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. And the next question is, because we have 24 months to spend our grant, we won't be applying for the grant this April. Will this hinder our chances of winning the grant next time we apply?
No, it won't. Yeah, there won't be any negative impact if you do have funding that you're sitting on, and you just don't need gaming grant funding this year. That's perfectly fine. You would just come in again the following year when you do need that support, and you would show what you would have shown otherwise in terms of the same documentation, and we'll assess your application just like we always have. There's no negative effect if you don't apply year after year.
Great. And I had a similar question emailed to me that was also from a group that is still using their 2020 funding and therefore not planning to apply for 2021. And they asked if they run a summer festival, are they able to apply now for 2022 for that summer?
I guess it would depend on their what the current fiscal year budget. So generally speaking, when you show us your budget, it's what you're planning on spending the funding on. A lot of the times that is in the future, so it would probably depend on the timing of things. So I'm not sure I could answer that without seeing the timing of that, but they may be able to, but it may be also an example that they could wait another 12 months and then they could apply and still have the funding in hand for that summer festival.
Great. Okay, the next question here is, when writing the narrative for each program, do we speak to how it rolled out specifically this past year or pivoted with the impact of COVID, or do we talk about what and how the program was delivered historically in a usual year?
That is a great question. I would say a little column A, a little column B. I mean, typically speaking, if there wasn't such a thing as COVID, you would kind of talk about the sort of year in, year out process of how that program unfolds. I think it'll be really, really helpful if groups, when they're applying to us, if they can provide some of that context of what it looked like over the past 12 months. What were you able to deliver? How did you have to change things? And that kind of gives us the information on assuming that there will be sort of this like transitional period of program delivery happening in a slightly different way this year. That'll tell us, what you're planning on doing for the next 12 months, assuming that, things are going to continue on in this slightly different environment. So yeah, tell us, about your program, and then tell us maybe what's been a little bit different and how you've responded over the past 12 months, and kind of what the plan is going forward.
Okay. This next question I'm not sure if you can answer. I'm just going to read it. The guidelines say that funds can only be internally restricted for a limited time. Does this pertain to gaming grant eligibility only, or is this a wider requirement for nonprofits? And is there a particular authority on this?
It is just for our program as far, well, not as far as I know. It is a rule that is specific to our program. Whether that rule is held elsewhere, I don't know, but I don't think so. It is something that is internal to our program, and that is about making sure that there is that financial need, that if groups are sitting on funding and they haven't been able to use it for the intended purpose, that that funding is going to be able to be used. And I think, from the perspective of a member of a society, for example, if you're seeing that your organization has funding and is not able to execute whatever that project is, the society might be saying, well, can't we spend that money on our programming or something like that? So it is something internal to our program. I'm not sure if it's used elsewhere, but it could be.
Thank you. There's a question asking for clarification on in-kind summary amounts. Did you say that those would not be included as part of the organization's operating budget, only as part of the program budget?
Yeah, so where that comes into play for us is when we look at it for that government 75% amount. So that's on the program financial side of things. Groups can put it in their organization financials, but it doesn't really come into play there. So it is something that is more specific to the program side of things.
Okay, and I've received a clarification on the question that was emailed about whether they can apply for 2022 for the summer festival programming. So we'll be running the festival this July and August, which will use up the 2020 funding. Our preference would be to apply now for July 2022 so that we can sort out our historic cash flow problems. So 2020's funding would be used up by the end of 2021, and any funding we receive in 2021 would be used by the end of August 2022.
So I think where it may become a little bit tricky is, say, you apply in the arts and culture intake, and say you apply toward the end, April 30th, we'll say the last day. It does take a little bit to have that funding assessed. If was it July that was going to take place?
The festival is July and August, yeah.
Okay, so if you received your funding before July, you would only have 12 months to spend it. So you might find yourself in a tricky spot if that 12 months is going to expire based on the timing of when you received the funding, but your festival actually hasn't taken place yet. So in that case, I might say, to be on the safe side, if you applied early in the intake next year, you would have plenty of time in order to receive that funding for the intended use.
Perfect. Okay, so we are at 2:30, and that was the last question. So great timing. And thank you so much, Denise, for answering all those questions. I know I kind of like rapid fired them at you,
All good.
but that was super helpful. And again, the recording of this will be posted on YouTube, and slides will be emailed out to everyone. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone. And thank you again to Denise, as well as to Liz and Jillian, our interpreters today.
Yes, thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.